Support for WKGC Public Media comes from listeners like you, people who believe in the power of local radio to inform, inspire, and connect the Emerald Coast community. Your gift helps keep educational and entertaining programs on the air while creating hands-on learning opportunities for students. Become a listener supporter today and give securely at WKGC.org. WKGC, education, entertainment, and everything in between. From WKGC Public Media, this is ReelTalk, the place where you can join the cinematic conversations frame by frame each week. I'm your host, R.L. Terry. If movies are your thing, you're in the right place. So fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a gripping show. This year marks 75 years since All About Eve, Joseph L. Mankiewicz's Oscar-winning backstage classic, first showed us that the spotlight can be both intoxicating and destructive. Starring the incomparable Bette Davis, it remains a cinematic masterclass in wit, ambition, and the quiet terror of being replaced by the next bright young thing. 30 years later, Paul Verhoeven's audacious Showgirls gave us a much louder, more garish echo of those same ideas. What Margo Channing's Broadway was to 1950, Nomi Malone's Las Vegas was to 1995, a hall of mirrors reflecting fame, desire, and identity as performance. One is hailed as one of the greatest films of all time. The other was once called one of the worst. But both confront the same truth. The cost of climbing the ladder to fame is often a loss of your sense of self. So today on ReelTalk, we're looking at two films separated by decades and sensibilities, but united by their fascination with ambition, the bright lights that promise everything, and the shadows that follow close behind. Joining me today for this retrospective is returning guest and friend of the show, film critic E.J. Moreno. Welcome back to the show, E.J.
I am so excited. What a group of movies you have included me with today.
I am too. When you said you could talk about these movies with me, I was delighted because I had a very short list of guests that I knew would be great on this show, and you, sir, were at the top of that list. So I'm very glad that you decided to come on. Listeners, you may remember him from the Weapons episode last month. And for those that do not, EJ is a member of the Critics' Choice Association and the Critics Association of Central Florida, of which I too am a member. Additionally, he's a senior contributor to the website and YouTube channel Flickering Myth. He's interviewed some fantastic guests on his YouTube show, so you may want to check those out when you have a chance. Speaking of which, any interviews you want to highlight for our listeners, EJ?
While listeners may not be able to enjoy this one as it's a written article, I did get to interview Elvira recently for her new cookbook.
Oh my goodness, no way. Oh, I'm so jealous.
Yes, we had a lovely conversation. She was great. And then this week I have an interview with Famke Jensen coming out, who is, I love her from the X-Men days, but we got to talk about her new Netflix series. So it is really, really fun to have a collection of divas that I'm always seeking out to chat with.
Oh, that's wonderful. You've really had some just fascinating individuals on your show. So listeners, if you want to catch in those interviews, EJ will share with you where you can find those a little bit later on here in the show. For 75 years, All About Eve has endured as both a pinnacle of Hollywood storytelling and a cautionary tale about the intoxicating and corrosive nature of ambition. And whether you're among those that believe Showgirls was simply ahead of its time or still see it as a camp disaster, one thing is deniable. Without All About Eve, Showgirls most likely would not exist at all, at least in the form that it does today. Both films explore manipulation and feel just as sharp and relevant today as they did in 1950 and 1995, respectively. Many parallels can be drawn to our contemporary times in which social media stardom and viral fame echo the same relentless pursuit of the spotlight and cyclical hunger for show business. And before we dive into All About Eve and then Showgirls, EJ, Describe the connections you see between the two films and why they continue to offer up material for thoughtful discussions 75 and 30 years later.
What a awesome two-part question there. So first off, the connection. It's two stories about amazing divas being fabulous, being, I don't want to say manipulated by the men around them, but the universe around them has kind of put our women in these positions, specifically looking at Eve Harrington in Showgirls and looking at Nomi Malone, where yes, they are very hungry and ambitious women, but there's a reason that they're here. They're not just pure evil figures in their stories.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting. And there's just this deep connection between generations. And I would also say we just saw this story. If you are a fan of professional wrestling, there's this company called All Elite Wrestling just did an All About Eve storyline. They have a character named Timeless Tony Storm. She's a 1950s wrestler that is in love with Turner Classic Movies. It's great. And she just had her young protege turn against her. They had a big year-long feud, and it's just crazy to see even wrestling understood. That is a common story. The younger, hungrier girl, and what are her intentions of doing it? Why is she doing it? And is our older actress, our older wrestler, our older Broadway star, is she kind of accepting that maybe it is time to step away? There's so many layers to the story that I just always find so amazing.
I'd say both All About Eve and Showgirls, they tell eerily similar stories. They express the ideas differently, but at their core, very similar. We're dealing with ambition and rivalry. And ultimately, though, I'd say those are more incidental because really what we're dealing with here is the steep cost of success in a world built on, say, performance and illusion. And I think these two films specifically continue to provoke discussions, much like the one we're having now, because they ask timeless questions. What must a woman sacrifice to succeed? You could also replace that, what must anybody sacrifice to succeed? Who gets to define the talent? Is it the critics? Is it the talent themselves? I do like how in All About Eve we have us critics still having the access in the classical sense that we really don't have today, because like us, we're the Margo Channing getting replaced by the Eve Harrington being all those influencers out there.
Yes.
But that's a topic for another time. But I mention that, though, because of how relevant it is. It is like, who's defining this? What happens when the performance becomes indistinguishable from reality? If we're talking the work that critics do, what happens when the quality of the writing takes second tier to or indistinguishable from merely fan reaction to something? Whether framed as prestige or parody, both of these films, they remain razor sharp. And I recently rewatched them for our show today, and they still are. And in both films, audiences can't look away. And so we're drawn into these stories. What I'd like to do is start with Bette Davis, because the consummate actress, she wouldn't have it any other way. So
yes.
Davis balances both fear and obsolescence, yet she has this fierce resilience. EJ, in what ways do you feel Davis transformed what could have easily been a one-dimensional aging diva into a fully realized multi-dimensional character?
It is something that happened in this era sometimes, where it feels like the movie is depicting their life. I often think of A Star is Born. Judy Garland is playing Judy Garland in the movie, but she's also the male character in that film too, of just the substance abuse. And I think Bette Davis is in this role. She is the aging diva, and she can see the reality in this script of what's happening, the ageism of, we're still dealing with that of once you turn 28, now you're too old. And it was something that we could get away with a little bit back then, where older actresses still had a place, but I think she saw the reality of what was happening around her. and perfectly used it to give it this role. And she never played anything one note. There was never a one dimension to Bette Davis. Like, even in her last role ever, you could just see something. She just understood roles. And I really believe, especially back in, looking at 1950, that there was a truth to this. And I think she played on it as much as Elizabeth Berkley plays on being overly sexualized and gawled at, and she understood that role too, and she's not as dumb as we thought. So I love that we can see that these women are really taking the story and living it a bit as well.
Yeah, although she was nominated, didn't win for her performance in this. Of course, what's also funny is at the same exact time, Gloria Swanson was nominated and also did not win for her definitive performance as Norma Desmond.
What a great Oscars that year. I was looking at it and I was like, oh my good, what this year to have been a gay Oscar fan in 1951, it's true diva-ness. It's amazing there.
Yeah, it's like these roles that are their definitive roles are not the ones for which they won their Oscars, and yet here we are still talking about them. In fact, oh gosh, I'm spacing on which actress did win. If you mentioned the name, I'd be like, oh yeah, that's the actress. So see how it is.
It's Judy Holliday for Born Yesterday, which. Oh, you're not All About Eve. You're not Sunset Boulevard. It's just, no. I also have an issue that the only actor to win an award from this film is a man, and George Sanders does well. And I'm not dissing him, but we had 4 women nominated, the only time that's ever happened, and the only one to win is the man. Yeah. What a perfect story for this. What a perfect story for this.
And it's actually very fitting. It's so much of what we're talking about today are direct parallels to that. I'd say, for me, building off of everything that you said about Davis and also connecting it to Elizabeth Berkley's performance, even though Gina Gershon plays Crystal, who is our Margo Channing in Showgirls, her performance here is one of the ones that jumps to the front of the mind when everybody thinks about Davis. It's not her Oscar-winning role in Jezebel. It's not her work in Of Human Bondage, which are both excellent. And I would say it's even rises above her turn as Baby Jane Hudson in Whatever Happened, Baby Jane. This is her definitive role because, like you said with Judy Garland, so much of Bette Davis is in this role. When I did a retrospective of Sunset Boulevard with our colleague Gino, so much of Gloria Swanson, although she was not as crazy as Norma Desmond, but so much of Gloria Swanson was in Norma Desmond, and so she delivers this volcanic turn as Margo Channing, and from beginning to end, electrifying performance. But there's more than just the performative dimension, which is what in part saves it from being this one-dimensional role. She grounds Margot's larger-than-life persona in real, tangible, emotional truth. Her famous sharp tongue and wit and theatrical presence are not just for show. They're actually armor because there's vulnerability there. At the same time, there's this self-awareness and self-deprecating humor about her character. And I'd say her portrayal of Margo is a masterclass in emotional complexity. It's not a one-note character, and it so very easily could have been. Her performance transcends the archetype of the aging diva to expose the raw, contradictory humanity beneath the aging diva trope. And so what makes her in part so enduring is how she refuses to let Margo be defined by vanity or the kind of shifting in her career, which is why we're rooting for her. Like we're drawn to her because she's human, and I love seeing that because it easily could have gone another way. When you when you think about All About Eve specifically, what do you think has kept All About Eve so relevant 75 years later? Is it Mankiewicz's dialogue? Is it the razor wit or the universal fear of being replaced? What do you think has kept it so relevant?
I think it's a mixture of all of those. The dialogue is great. There's a scene with Davis and Ritter, who plays Birdie in the film, Thelma Ritter.
Isn't she great, Thelma Ritter? She's so good.
She would have been my best supporting actress win that year. She is one of those roles. I believe there's a role like this in Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte that is just a small role.
Agnes Moorehead's role.
Yes.
They share some similarities.
And I love Agnes Moorehead in that movie, and I love Thelma Ritter in this, and I love this character that can go back and forth with our main person, and it works. And there's that scene where they're trying on the dress, and Davis says it's a little too 17-ish, which is also crazy because teenagers was a newer by 1950. Teenager is still a newish concept. That's still, that wasn't a big market point and or a talking point. So just again, how advanced that dialogue feels, looking back when this was probably written 49 to be produced for 50, so it's wild how ahead of its time. And like you said, everyone's scared of being replaced. I just used a professional wrestling reference. This is in mostly I would say art industries, but we see it with tech people. We see it with, there's Succession, it's in the name. Like we see this often of, I want what you have, and I do believe men have the slight privilege of, we can have 3 men at the top, and there can only ever be 1 woman. And I believe that, but that it's still a universal feeling. It still does happen. I just do believe societally, women do often feel like there can only be one. There's always a battle of, well, who's the main star? And it's just like, again, it's just a very universal concept, and it's aged well, sadly. We've never fixed these issues in All About Eve. We didn't fix it by 95. We haven't fixed it by 2025.
Yeah, I think that that universal fear of being replaced is, I think, a huge part of why the film's plot and characters continue to feel relevant 75 years later. Margot's crisis mirrors what many feel in a culture obsessed with youth and novelty and reinvention. And I'd say that Eve Harrington isn't just a character, she's a concept, which is really cemented at the very end when it's just like, oh, how the tides have turned. Neither one of our leading ladies gets to be in the closing shot of the film because we have a new up-and-comer who is about to pull an Eve Harrington, just like we saw. I think this movie plays to insecurities that we feel. I feel that it reminds us of how vulnerable our positions are, and it's, in a way, it kind of breaks down any pretense that we may have about it. Bette Davis gave the film fire. Mankiewicz gave it its words, but it's the haunting question of what happens when the applause stops that keeps it eternally relevant. It really cuts to the bone because it captures that tension that we've all felt at one time or another. Maybe you're feeling it now. Listeners, maybe you're feeling it now. I know when I look at how film criticism has changed over the years, I can even draw parallels to what we see in All About Eve to contemporary film criticism. And so it's our ability to overlay all these different ideas on it because it's a universal fear. And so we have this just perfect collision between artifice and authenticity, between ambition and self-worth, captured in this film, which transcends gender and age, and it's to where it's applicable to all of our lives. And the film and all of the different creatives that brought it from page to screen, crafted this perfect storm of of insight into the human condition. You're listening to Real Talk on 90.7 WKGC. I'm your host, R.L. Terry, and today I am joined by returning guest and friend of the show, film critic E.J. Moreno. This hour, we are celebrating the 75th anniversary of the masterful, timeless All About Eve and the 30th anniversary of its audacious and oft-maligned descendant, Showgirls. When we come back, EJ and I will continue our conversation, so don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Real Talk on 90.7 WKGC. I'm your host, R.L. Terry, and today I am joined by returning guest and friend of the show, film critic EJ Moreno. This hour, we are celebrating the 75th anniversary of the masterful, timeless All About Eve and the 30th anniversary of its audacious and oft-maligned descendant, Showgirls. EJ, there are clear parallels between All About Eve's Broadway and today's what I'll call toxic influencer social media culture. How can we use Eve as a lens through which we can better understand it? In other words, what does the plot and characters speak to today?
I have been waiting for this because I have the worst answer for you. It is, if any one of your listeners are listening to and has ever seen the Cardi B and Nicki Minaj drama, it is an All About Eve happening on social media. It is
goodness.
Nicki Minaj being a rapper from 15 to almost 20 years ago, which I cannot believe. 2008 is that long ago almost already. Who has continuously had problems with every younger female rapper under her, and it's quite wild to see what I just said. Why can't we both exist here? But when you have someone calling you, there's a quote from Mariah Carey years ago when someone called her, they said, Ariana Grande is like the young Mariah Carey. And Mariah said, I'm the young Mariah Carey. And it was just this very audacious thing of going, the new girl's already here. And Mariah having to go, okay, I'm not dead.
Yes.
I think All About Eve is saved from, surprisingly, the 1950s movie does not feel as misogynistic with the men.
Yeah.
It does feel like Eve is coming in, where it feels like a lot of Nomi stuff is in Showgirls. When we get to that, is her history of being a sex worker, her history of men. That really does fuel her passion, where Eve, maybe I was wrong. Maybe Eve is just a little evil, and maybe that is why I like her so much.
Oh my goodness. When I look at the film, its plot and its characters, I'd say, before Instagram, before TikTok, Mankiewicz seemed to understand the future. He seemed to understand the seductive and even corrosive nature of visibility, validation, and performance in ways that are still delivering insight to today. Through Eve Harrington, we see the template for the modern social climber who curates an image, manipulates narratives, and thrives in a world where attention equals power. And I see that all the time, whether it's on firsthand accounts on social media or in just what I hear people describe. I don't have TikTok on my phone. I very rarely ever look at Reels on Instagram or Facebook. I'm maybe a dinosaur in that respect, but in what I see, it's almost terrifying. It's just like just because you have a million followers does not make you a writer, director, or an actor. However, we're constantly seeing that just because you have a lot of followers, you are somehow a director, writer, or actor, or your opinion is somehow more weighty than somebody who may actually have maybe more experienced or educated in whatever the subject is. They just don't happen to have all the followers because they're relying on the subject matter, not the flash. And I think we see a lot of that today on social media. I'd say, in today's what I call toxic influencer ecosystem, Eve is really the prototype of the aspirational persona. Someone who crafts a story designed to win sympathy, designed to win admiration, and grant access. She has a sentimental, tearful backstory. Of course, we later learn that she makes up virtually everything in her backstory. But she wins everybody into her corner instantly with this tearful backstory. And I'd say it kind of functions like a viral post. Emotionally manipulative, selectively edited. She's editing. It's be the equivalent of in-camera editing. She's in-mind editing, if we could go with that. And she's engineering this she's this viral persona right there in Margo Channing's dressing room. But what I like about Margo's journey is, much like today, we are seeing this reclamation of authenticity. We're seeing it in foods. We're seeing it in some personalities online, and I really like that. I'd say viewed through today's lens, All About Eve isn't just a backstage drama. If it was, I don't think you and I would be talking about it right now.
No.
I'd say, or not to the degree we are. I'd say it's an early case of the study in social media culture. Much like the events of, say, Network in 1976, you could parallel to the events of the state of news and journalism and even entertainment today. And so there are films out there like Eve, like Network, Sunset Boulevard, and others that are written in a way they remain timeless because we can apply these events to our lives as the world changes. And so I that's what I love about these the parallels between what I see in the film and what we have today. Now, speaking of social media and Eve Harrington, and what she would do with it, I throw that question to you, EJ. Do you think if Eve Harrington existed now, would she be an aspiring actress like she is in All About Eve, or do you think that she would be a viral content creator sliding into DMs? Like, what do you think about that?
I guess the only retort I would say to you is, or also kind of a acknowledgement of what you said, is we are a bit pushing for authenticity. I see it a lot in the Nepo baby conversation. And I believe the idea of, yes, some people get their foot in the door. Some people get their foot in the door with their millions of subscribers. Maya Hawke talked about that recently. She did an interview of talking about how, her parents' name helped her more than having a social media following. But also at the same time, once you get in that door, we are also more aware and we're looking at you. If Eve Harrington was not good at her job, she would have been instantly rejected. So there has to be some talent to back yourself up. And I think because we're hyper aware of that. If we have this viral star or this aspiring actress, I think it's interesting because you still have to be good, and I think that's what makes her character interesting, is she isn't just there for the spot. She is good at her job as well. So it's interesting when you start seeing this, and I don't know, because I think we have this idea of a lot of these social media people are vapid, and I don't think Eve is a vapid character. I think she's smart, much like I will say, her counterpart, and I think Nomi is a very smart character in Showgirls. And I think these women understand, and they're playing the system. And I believe we have to do that sometimes. Do I love that the social media stars are smart? But I've also been like, well, what if I gain a bigger following? And then what if I use that to my advantage? Because I do think I'm okay at what I do. So it's interesting of saying, I think these are smart characters. I don't think, it goes back to someone who has a small role in this. It's the Marilyn Monroe mentality. We give them that. We think they're dumber. They're playing us as much as we think we're playing them. They're playing us too.
Yeah, speaking of Marilyn Monroe, listeners, although it's a minor role in the film, you do have an early Marilyn Monroe in All About Eve. And you mentioned these characters are smarter than they may appear on the surface, or that to which we may give them credit. And in real life, Marilyn Monroe had an IQ that exceeded that of Albert Einstein's. It's crazy. as we all know, IQ isn't the end all be all. It's it's at best a measurement of the capacity to learn. Um, but I still find it very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
There's like, oh my gosh, Marilyn Monroe had an IQ that exceeded that of Albert Einstein's. And if you follow Marilyn Monroe's career, you do see how smart she was. And I love seeing an early Marilyn Monroe in this film, and she doesn't get talked about as much as some of the other actors. Miss Caswell, listeners, is who she plays. But yeah, so you get an early Marilyn Monroe here in the film. But back to what would Eve be doing today, so to speak? I don't think she would be lurking backstage. I think she'd be online, curating her persona with precision. Because, to your point, many of these individuals are very smart. They have a lot of marketing know-how. I'd say the modern Eve wouldn't necessarily, be the aspiring actress, and she's more likely to be that viral content creator, and then whatever doors, may open, thereafter.
Is her counterpart Kim Kardashian then?
The
marketing geniuses, as much as I don't think the Kardashians are great at what they do, they're very good at.
They really are. I never thought about that before, EJ. That's a really good point, because I'd say Eve today would be a master manipulator of image and algorithm. And to your point, perhaps that's what we do have in the Kardashians, master manipulators of image and algorithms. So algorithms now, when they first did their thing, we didn't think about algorithms as much. But now I would say that's how it is. And so I'd say she would, much like they treat television, I would say legacy media and new or social media as they do, I would say Eve, she would treat Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook as her stage. Because I love how we have that early argument in the dressing room that theater isn't just these few blocks on Broadway. Theater is everywhere. So this would be her stage. And I didn't really think about that before. That was really, really very interesting. I'm gonna have to give that some thought after we get out of the show today. All About Eve endures, I feel, as a timeless film, because at its core, it's less about a particular moment in Broadway's golden age and less about these specific events. As I mentioned earlier, we can apply, aspects of our own lives to these characters and plots. I'd say it remains timeless because it is more about ambition and ego, that relentless pursuit of relevance. These are dynamics that still fuel our personal lives and certainly the entertainment industry today. EJ, why do you think we seem to have fewer and fewer films destined to reach timeless classic status in the way that both Sunset Boulevard and All About Eve did 75 years ago?
As a lover of pop culture, when you said you are not online, I am a chronically online human being. So I see it. You know what I think it is? I've thought long and hard about this. We don't have a monoculture anymore. There's not one thing we all agree on. Maybe, we have a Taylor Swift that everyone has an opinion on, but that's hard nowadays. That, the Marvel movies, I think, were, peak Endgame, Infinity War Marvel movies was the last time that collectively, I think everyone had an opinion on something. I think we have them every now and then, even if you don't love it. I do think a movie like Get Out in 2016, everyone had an opinion. Everyone talked about it. Yeah. That was hard to do. Barbie and Oppenheimer a couple years ago also fell into that. And it's hard to do. I think, what it is? We lost good marketing. I really think, where are the McDonald's toys? Where are the plastic cups I can buy for Batman Forever at, my Burger King? I think we've lost a bit of that flair. And I think, not to say that All About Eve and Sunset Boulevard had these marketing machines behind it, but I think in the 80s and 90s, we were seeing that lack of the monoculture going. So we did increase our marketing. We did make it go, well, if you miss this, you're not cool. You have to be a part of this. Titanic, Avatar, Avatar still does it. The last one that we just had, we were kind of all shocked. We were like, what do you mean that made a lot of money again? It's because
Yeah.
people like it. And, we were almost shamed. You didn't see Avatar? What do you
Mm-hmm.
mean? It's interesting. But yeah, I think that's been my big theory is we just don't have a culture that everyone watches the same thing anymore.
Yeah. So it sounds like that. Um, sounds like what you're saying is that these films, Sunset and Eve, existed at a rare intersection
Hmm.
that we only get glimpses of today. This
Yeah.
intersection of artistry, cultural relevance you talked about were less monoculture than we once were, and there's all kinds of divisions and fractions out there, and that could be an entire discussion in and of itself. And
Yes.
so it's and the industry is much harder to replicate today. Back then it's the operating under the studio system, and despite there were some things that it got wrong, it did get some things right. It provided a formalized structure that nurtured strong scripts, disciplined direction, and cultivated iconic performances. And so I'd say the industry valued story and character as its main currency, whereas today the major studios now value intellectual property, the box office appeal over dialogue-driven, psychologically rich dramas that defined 1950 as well as other decades. Also, studios were willing to take more risks back then. Studios and production companies are largely risk-averse today. But I'd say perhaps the deeper reason lies in kind of indirectly connected with what you've already said, EJ. It's in how our culture consumes meaning.
Yeah.
Films like Sunset and Eve are not just entertainment. They were reflections, these dark mirrors, and we don't have as many of those films today. The wit and the cynicism that they contained felt dangerous, even scandalous back then. But now cynicism seems to be the baseline. So many films nowadays are very cynical, and I think it's like that's why in part they don't stand out. But I'd say if there's looking back at how the studios cranked out films, even though one might argue, well, it's kind of like an assembly line. Well, it may have been an assembly line. However, we have these films that we are still talking about today. And to your point, we do have films like Get Out, that will be talked about decades from now. But I'd say there are percentage-wise fewer today than there was, in the, the looking at pre-studio system, post-studio system.
Hmm.
And speaking of post-studio system, we have Showgirls, which the 90s, there's still some shadows of the studio system left, but largely, we've moved past that. And Showgirls, as I mentioned, listeners, earlier, it's this provocative descendant of All About Eve. Maybe you never thought that about Showgirls before, but EJ, Showgirls has experienced one of the most remarkable critical reevaluations in modern film history. I can't think of another great example. Maybe Rocky Horror Picture Show. But I'd say this, is even been reevaluated even more deeply than Rocky Horror has. I'd say that the box office, it went from this box office punchline to cult classic, and has been interpreted as a feminist text with some readings highlighting its challenge to heteronormativity. Before we go into our next break here, and we'll continue the discussion afterwards, but real quick, EJ, what accounts for this shift in the audience interpretation of Showgirls?
I don't know. I think I'm from an era where I had missed Showgirls being released. I'm 34, so I had just missed, when it was coming out, I was 5. So I wasn't, pop culturally, aware of things. But so by the time I kind of stumbled upon Showgirls on my own, I really didn't know it was considered one of the worst movies ever. So I'm watching it going, this is a diva off. This is just two women being fat. Like, what do you
Yeah.
mean? Maybe there's too many boobs for me, but you know what? Also, you see so many boobs out of that movie, it just looks like their shirt. Like, I just ignore the topless women, and I'm just like, that's just what women look like in this universe. So I'm reading and looking at this movie going, oh, cool, I like it. And then, researching it and finding out the negative reception. So I think
Mm,
there was a group of people who missed that original wave. And I think there was also people who were screaming even then.
mm,
Tarantino, I believe, what was it, 96 or something, a couple years after, said he was a fan of Showgirls and said it
mm,
was an exploitation movie, so it's interesting we had people then even going, there's something else here. I just think it took a while, and I think it took the queer community,
mhm,
specifically gay men,
mhm,
really elevated this thing and would just be like, no, you have to watch it.
mhm,
And I just don't know. I can't nail it perfectly, but I really have enjoyed it finding the spotlight and having its
mhm.
moment, because I don't think it's a bad movie. Is it a bit over the top? Sure.
Maybe just a little.
Is Joe Esterhouse's script? Sometimes I'm like, what is your problem with women? We'll talk about that
Yeah.
later. But for the most part, I don't think it's a bad movie.
Yeah.
And I think that's what helps it at its core. I think it was just ahead of its time.
Mm. I love those thoughts, and we're going to pick up on this question when we come back from break. You're listening to Real Talk on 90.7 WKGC. I'm your host, R.L. Terry, and today I am joined by returning guest and friend of the show, film critic E.J. Moreno. This hour we are celebrating the 75th anniversary of the masterful, timeless All About Eve and the 30th anniversary of its audacious and often maligned descendant, Showgirls. When we come back, EJ and I will pick up our discussion right where we left off. Keep listening. Welcome back to Real Talk on 90.7 WKGC. I'm your host, R.L. Terry, and today I am joined by returning guest and friend of the show, film critic E.J. Moreno. This hour we are celebrating the 75th anniversary of All About Eve and the 30th anniversary of Showgirls. Now, before we went into the break, we were talking about the reevaluation of Showgirls, and I think in part there's this reevaluation because there's a greater appreciation of camp and films that go on to become cult film culture later. Of course, we never know at the time. Well, I should say, generally speaking, we don't know at the time it's going to become a cult classic. Rare occasions we do. I'd say Showgirls and Rocky Horror are probably ones that we could have picked out, but for the most part, it's really only time tells us what's going to be a cult classic. I'd say audiences seem to have re-embraced Showgirls for its audacious excess. Showgirls is a film that I've used when lecturing on American cinema, and these are often the reactions that I get from students, where there is this more of an embrace or appreciation for that which we define as camp or cult film. I think people are drawn to its unapologetic artifice and its sheer commitment to spectacle. Ideas that once defined Vegas. After a recent trip to Vegas, for me, I'm like, where is this? Where's the spectacle
Hmm.
of it all? I'm not seeing it as much anymore. I'd say viewers, looking back at it, they're not expecting realism any longer. They see it as a satire of American consumerism, sexual commodification, and even the illusion of empowerment. And I think the badness, or how it was referred to as being bad, became part of its allure. And I think those are reasons why we're now drawn to it in ways perhaps we weren't before. It's the intentional irony, camp, subversion, and what was once, I feel, just thought of as trash or being just thought of as cinematic fodder, but it can now be read as transgressive art. There's even a mirror quality to it. We The same dark glamour All About Eve explored, but now it's refracted through the lens of 90s excess. Any other thoughts on what has driven this reevaluation of Showgirls, EJ?
I don't, I always just go, Showgirls is just perfect. And we weren't ready.
Mm-hmm.
I always feel like maybe Elizabeth Berkley was also in over her head.
Mm-hmm.
There's just
Okay.
so much to this movie that
Yeah.
I feel bad for. And
Mm-hmm.
I just feel like I mean, because you look at Paul Verhoeven's also record, he never had a flop like this at that point. But
Yeah.
he was also a king of movies that were a little too out of its time. Look at RoboCop.
Yeah. Basic
Uh,
Instinct.
Basic
Another
Instinct,
one that I think has
Starship
been,
Troopers.
yes, exactly.
He's always like 5 years too early.
I'd say so. I know you and friend of the show, EJ, not EJ Sassani, Gino Sassani. I have a screening of Showgirls coming up. I know at the time that we're broadcasting the show, you haven't had the screening yet. But just really quickly, what do you anticipate? Have you heard from individuals that are going? Just real quickly, what do you think you're going to encounter, or what have you heard so far going into this screening,
You know,
ahead of
Showgirls
the
is
screening?
yeah, Showgirls is so hard because it feels like it has been talked about like ad nauseum. There's a version specifically that I love by David Schmader who does a commentary track over it. It's on the Showgirls Blu-ray. It is how I like to consume my Showgirls because he's so funny. It's such a good version. And I just feel like it's always this conversation point. It's always this thing.
Yeah.
I'm hoping my audience, I can get them to treat it like a Rocky Horror. I want
Okay.
everyone to go different places and we throw our fries in the air. You know, there's so many little moments that I want us to toast with our chips.
Yeah.
Like they do. You
Is
know,
that a can
I
of doggy
think
chow?
we should eat doggy chow as well. But, you know, again, that whole doggy chow, there's so much subtext that's supposed to be there. I just don't think Elizabeth Berkley was strong enough as an actress to deliver the subtext. And that's, again, I think there's just this fuming reaction of like, we want this to do better now. You know, I've seen just a video a couple days ago of Elizabeth Berkley within a screening of this doing the thrust it dance with her audience. And the fact that she's embraced it as well, I think we've also as a culture, and I've talked to a friend who's attending the screening, is just so happy that it's not taboo anymore. Elizabeth Berkley isn't embarrassed by this. Kyle MacLachlan will joke about it now. You know, it's just nice to see that we all have collectively gone, no, we were too mean to that. There's actually bad movies we could yell at.
Yeah. So the I cannot wait to hear about your experience. You'll have to you and Gina will have to share with me what the audience reaction is to the film. I do think that if you release Showgirls today, same cast, same creative team, same exact everything, I do think it would play much differently today than it did back then, because I think there is a lot of understanding of these characters and the story in which this is taking place that just got missed back then. And I think with very few, if any, changes at all, it would play much better today. And in fact, you could strip away the mink coats and Vegas mink coats from Eve and Vegas glitter from Showgirls. And I think the films would both still suggest the same haunting idea that the spotlight is never enough because there's always some new spotlight. It's like once you achieve that spotlight, there's always something else out there. So EJ, do you think that message about the pursuit of the spotlight has grown more potent in our social media age, where fame can be won or lost overnight? What are your ideas there?
Yeah, there's so many thoughts to this. I mean, looking at 1950 when All About Eve came out, we were wanting that cynicism. We were wanting that commentary. By Showgirls 95, we haven't gone full angsty Gen X yet. We were still on the cusp of the grunge movement. You know, we were still like not fully turned against the glamour of the 80s. We were just starting to by the time Showgirls was released. Where now I look at it and we are very aware of cancel culture. We are very aware of how quickly things can shift and how fame is fleeting. I mean, as a Lady Gaga fan, she wrote a whole album about the fame and how the artifice of it and how to manipulate it. And we've seen her, you know, not many pop stars have stayed relevant that long. And I think that awareness of the fame and how to use it has worked, and how to live in the social media age is hard. And I think it's interesting because I think we're not as harsh as we were to our Gina Gershons or our
Mm-hmm.
Bette Davis. I think we respect our older women in our community now, and we have a place for them,
Yeah.
and I think that's lightened up a bit. I think, to be honest, it's harder for 35 to 40-year-olds sometimes. They're the ones. Once you get to 60, then you're cool again. So
Yeah.
I think, our culture has changed in such a way of who we're doing this to now and who is the victim of the All About Eve Showgirls curse.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting how this has evolved, where we've gotten better in some regards, and then worse in some regards, where we are very, the 20-year-olds are so vapid and getting work done. I'm like, you can't get a facelift at 22. What are you doing? That's not what we're supposed to. It's
Yeah.
interesting of what we've done, and where we are culturally, and how different we are from 1950 to 1995. But
Mm-hmm.
how better and worse we are in those
Yeah.
regards.
Yeah, I'd say yeah, the primal fears that into which both of these films tap is why you can strip away all the surface stuff, all the spectacle, and you're still left with something incredibly rich, because we can see ourselves as either Crystal or Nomi. We can see ourselves as either Eve or uh, oh my gosh, or Margo. There I go.
Yes.
There I go. We can see ourselves as either of these characters, depending upon where we are in our lives, and we, to your point, we've seen what can happen on social media with success overnight, or you're canceled overnight. Again, we could have an entire discussion about that. These films inspire tons of different thoughtful discussions,
Mm-hmm.
and I love that they do this. Both of these films, although they are, vastly different in their expression of these ideas we're talking about, they are dealing both with ambition, dealing with ambition as performance. In Showgirls, Nomi's climb feels more brutal than exploitive. Um, uh, so, do you think that Verhoeven is exposing the entertainment industry's hypocrisy, or do you think he's indulging it? EJ, what do you think about that?
There's a mix of both there. I think
Mm.
looking at Showgirls post Me Too,
Mm-hmm.
Nomi has a right to be angry. Nomi's had it rough with men.
Yeah.
And the fact that she is not happy, the fact that she's, it's interesting. I think, because Verhoeven, has this young girl naked. I mean, we see a lot of
Mm-hmm.
Elizabeth Berkley in this movie, and she's
Yeah.
fresh off Saved by the Bell. So there
Mm-hmm.
is this exploitation of young women, but there is
Mm-hmm.
also this power in it where that but that also, I think that's such a sometimes a gay male reading where
Mm-hmm.
women, that goes to the rape and revenge genre, and how so many
Mm-hmm.
people do find it to be empowering, and some people are
Yeah.
very disgusted by it. So I do like the raw sexuality, and I do feel that there's a hell yes to this movie where yes,
Mm-hmm.
we're exposing this, but at the
Mm-hmm.
same time we have, what was she, 20
Yeah.
something in this movie, fully naked, where
Yeah.
Gina Gershon does not have that same level of nudity. She is naked
No.
in this movie, and she's great.
Mm-hmm.
And oh my God, we haven't even really talked about Gina Gershon and my girl
Mm-hmm.
Crystal Connors and how much I love her so much. The
Yeah.
cowboy hats, the coke
Mm-hmm.
sniffing. Oh, there's just so much craziness from her role. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's just interesting where it is somewhere in the middle of exposing but
Mm-hmm.
also indulging, and I think sometimes that's how exploitation movies are. And that's,
Yeah.
I will agree with Tarantino's reading of it. This feels like a exploitation movie.
Yeah, I'd say there's great tension there, and I think the tension is, to your point, it's a balance. So I do think we have both. There is exposing, and there's indulgence in here. So I'd say it's both, and deliberately so. So the film's form mimics the mechanisms it
Hmm.
critiques. It's exploitive in the same way in the same way consumerism is or can be gaudy, excessive, hungry. And I say the genius and danger of Showgirls, it refuses to um, safely distance itself from these ideas. It's right up on them. Viewed through this lens, I'd say Showgirls becomes a savage inversion of All About Eve. Whereas Mankiewicz exposes ambition's psychological cost, Verhoeven exposes its physical and moral toll through excess and vulgarity, which again is a testament to just how smart Showgirls really is. And we're about at the end of the show here. So real quickly, listeners, if you're curious who inspired characters of Eve Harrington and Margo Channing, they were inspired by different individuals throughout Broadway history. No one person. So some people think that it's Tallulah Bankhead, and although Tallulah herself thought it was, it turns out it isn't. Really quickly, and look this up on your own time, listeners. We have Elizabeth Bergner, whom is cited as being, the inspiration for Mary Orr, who wrote the original story on which Mankiewicz penned his screenplay. Elizabeth Bergner, who encountered an individual named Ruth Maxine Hirsch, who Ruth Maxine would become our Eve Harrington in there. So really fascinating history there. So no single pair of women can be pinpointed as the Margo or the Eve, but these characters emerged from a patchwork of real events and personalities in history. And I'm afraid we're going to have to round out our discussion here, EJ. But I've absolutely loved it. The films. Listeners, if you ever can catch them on the big screen, catch them on the big screen. If not, you can always watch them at home, but they pack a punch, whether on the big screen, the big stage, or on that small screen in your pocket. And other films that you can include in the same orbit: Sunset Boulevard, Black Swan, 2 different decades, 2 different eras. Both these films explored tension between artistry and ambition and the price of staying in the spotlight. So whether it's Margo Channing warning us to fasten our seatbelts, or Crystal Connors warning to Nomi Malone,
there's always someone younger and hungrier coming down the stairs after you.
Yes, it is. These characters remind us that fame, for all its glitter, is never free. Well, EJ, I know you and I could continue this, but the curtain must come down on our show today. So thanks again for coming on the show. Where can listeners read your reviews, watch your YouTube videos, and any other content that you produce?
Yeah, I'm on YouTube. FlickeringMyth.com is the website, but Flickering Myth is the YouTube channel. You can also just Google EJ Moreno, EJ Moreno, and all of my stuff comes up there. Please join me for more conversations on controversial and fun films like this.
So, and if you missed any of today's episode, or to listen to past episodes of ReelTalk or other shows on WKGC, we are on a podcatcher near you. Just search for WKGC Public Media on your podcast service of choice. Next week on ReelTalk, we are going to be counting down our top 10 Halloween films to watch Halloween week. And EJ will be back with us, and I'm hoping to have another guest for you guys as well, so come back next week. Stay tuned for Jazz in a Minor Key with Walter Hale coming up next, followed by the all-new afternoon drive show, The Afternoon Spin, with DJ Maggie starting at 3 o'clock. Thanks to all of you for listening. I hope you'll tune in again next week, same time, same place, for more Real Talk on 90.7 WKGC. Support for WKGC Public Media comes from listeners like you, people who believe in the power of local radio to inform, inspire, and connect the Emerald Coast community. Your gift helps keep educational and entertaining programs on the air while creating hands-on learning opportunities for students. Become a listener supporter today and give securely at WKGC.org. WKGC, education, entertainment, and everything in between.